Hey there, Nomads of Lore. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Sean.
And we are Mead and Mischief, your home away from no home.
Lots of mischief going on.
Lots of mischief tonight. That's right. So today we're going to be discussing all about good and evil, evil and good. In this modern era of super layered, complex protagonists and villains, where we have villains who are bad but yet still good, and good guys who are good but yet still bad in some ways, is there any room for just a good old-fashioned light versus dark, good versus evil? And our answer to that question is a definite yes. Today we're going to be discussing how that is a yes through the lens of The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, and why it is one of the best examples of a pure light versus dark, good versus evil story.
Absolutely. So just like all these other we still don't have a real solid name for this series because Masterclass is kind of already taken. But in this series where we're looking at these different IPs and different topics, we've been having kind of a summary. We're telling you what we're going to tell you before we tell you, and then we tell you, and then we tell you what you told you at the end. You know, that old school teaching tactic. We're going to do the same thing.
Keep it simple, stupid. Oh, no,
yeah.
Sorry.
Keep it simple, silly. That's the PC version or something. Yeah. Keep it simple, stupid. The three things that we're going to talk about and we're going to highlight that Tolkien did a particularly good job of telling a really good versus evil story that holds up still today in 2021 in this era of moral ambiguity, like Jonathan just mentioned, all these other things, is, first of all, it has clear good versus evil. That is a strong contrast, and we get to see this really clear evil thing, evil person. We'll talk about why that's good and when we get to that point, and it contrasted with these really clear good and really clear evil, right? So the way it's good is because it has them. And then our second point, we'll fill that out a little bit for you in a minute, but our second point is that even though it does have these really clear good versus evil things that are very easy to see and easy to understand, it also has several characters within it that are more layered and more nuanced and have more points and more themes and concepts and ideas. We're going to talk about those. And then our third and final point is going to be that because of the format of good versus evil and this big kind of blanket thing, Tolkien was able to use some pieces in there to hit things that he thought were important and real world problems and conflicts and ideas that mirror, not allegory, but we'll get into that later. So yeah, let's dive into our three ideas.
Awesome. So let's deep dive into our first point of good versus evil. The good is good and the evil is evil, and these things are separate and they're pretty true. There's a pendulum either, or there's a marker either way. So our evil, Sauron, is a mysterious and never seen evil, and so he's kind of ever looming, I guess you could say, throughout the series. But you know that he is evil. He's never directly seen, but this allows for the nuance between him and pretty much the at least for these novels, the polar opposite of him would be Gandalf, and he would be pretty much our pure good. And this allows for all this nuance of these characters in between, which we can go a little bit more into.
So this first point that it's having clear-cut, visible good versus evil, it really, your worldview matters a lot on whether you see this as being even a good thing at all. There's plenty of people that would be like, oh yeah, this shouldn't exist in fiction or movies or whatever. But as Christians, for us, we believe that there is a true good. There is a actual good. There is God, right? And there is an actual bad, right? And so for our worldview, this really fits. And so this story, and we like these other, whether it's Sanderson or some of these others, where we get to see interesting, more nuanced characters, more real life kind of things, and whatever else, all that kind of stuff. But this is it's important and it's enjoyable as Christians to be able to look at these true good versus evil stories. Now, if this isn't your worldview, this part may not be your cup of tea. Now, our next 2 points, I think, even if you're not a Christian or you don't have a true moralistic good and evil worldview, I think our next 2 points still might kind of be a little more interesting to you even still, because they add some layers within all of that.
Before we go on, spoiler warning, whatever it is. Yeah, we're going to definitely be deep diving into a little bit more of the characters and things that will probably spoil these books / movies for you. So,
absolutely. Yeah. So if you're not familiar, you may want to click away, or you may want to click now and get some insight before you read it, especially if you're doing it for like school or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, so our next point that we talked about is that having these clear-cut good and evil, right, is that it allowed Tolkien to have a lot more subtle characters with more subtle motivations and subtle moralities and things. And so we're going to talk about a few examples from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. We're staying within Lord of the Rings. Some of the best examples of some of this, I will note just as a small side note, are really in like Silmarillion and some of the more extended Tolkien. I mean, there's so much amazing stuff, which we probably will get into at some point, especially as the Amazon not Wheel of Time, that one too. Click on the iCard. We'll link our Wheel of Time video up there.
Everything's about Wheel of Time.
Everything's about Amazon, apparently. Amazon Lord of the Rings show, which has a $500,000 budget for the first season or whatever. So yeah, for the first season, $500 million. $500 million wouldn't be $500 million. But anyway, especially as that, we'll probably do a few more things talking about Silmarillion and all that kind of stuff.
We should look up and see how much the movies were, the Peter Jackson movies.
A ridiculous amount.
But
anyway,
good grief.
Yeah, excuse me.
$500 million's a lot.
Yeah, it broke records, even Game of Thrones season 8 and whatever else.
Wow,
all that kind of stuff. But anyway. So the first example of more nuance and more subtle motivations that we want to talk about is the two kings, or should I say the king and the steward. That's Theoden and Denethor, right? And so if you're need a slight brush up, Theoden is the king of the Rohirrim, the horse folks. The kind of in the films, they're kind of more Celtic inspired design, which is gorgeous. There's a lot of things that take issue with in Peter Jackson's things, but the look and feel is not one of them. Anyway, without going too far on rabbit trail, so that's who he is. Denethor is the steward of Gondor. He's Boromir and Faramir's father, and he's over Minas Tirith and all of that kind of stuff, which we're actually going to talk a little bit more about those two in a minute. But those two characters are brilliant in the books. The way they're written and the way they contrast each other is super, super cool. In my opinion, is one of the things that Peter Jackson screwed up the most in Lord of the Rings. Not The Hobbit. We get into that totally separate thing. But in Lord of the Rings, the look and feel of everything, including these two characters, is great. But the point, I think he missed the point. And so if you've only seen the films and not read the books, you may not have the full picture, and these characters may seem kind of flat and whatever. But in the books especially, those characters and their motivations is extremely interesting. You would start with Theoden and his being corrupted by Wormtongue and all of that, and he doesn't have any spells cast over him by Saruman. That's just a film thing. But him being corrupted and him basically not being aware. It's kind of that classic king is not aware of what's going on in the kingdom because his corrupt evil advisor is shielding him and controlling him, and he is not aware of what's happening with his son and his nephew and all of those kind of things. And then he kind of gets woken up and we see this proud, which is interesting because we're going to talk about that later. He is very proud but wise and caring and what's the word? What is the word I'm looking? Oh, heroic.
Oh.
Is the word. Heroic king, that it goes through all this interesting and it has a good relationship with Gandalf and all this stuff happens. And then we go and look at Denethor, who in the books, especially in the films, he is bonkers from the beginning. Like he's sitting there eating grapes and tomatoes and this disgusting stuff, and he's just uncaring. And he's just shifted all the way from there. But in the books, he's likable at first. Like you think he's a good guy. You saw, and so he starts out as. But then we learn that through fear, and which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Through fear, he has basically kind of gotten in league with Sauron, and he's done evil things. And he's basically, in order to try to protect his kingdom, he's gone bonkers, and he goes. And so we take these two characters on this interesting journey of this one character that starts out corrupt and whatever else, and he's almost evil in his non-caringness, and goes ultimately to ultimate heroic sacrifice, his death, in the end. And it's not what turns that. Well, talk about that later. Actually, may do we could do a whole video about all of this stuff. It's a lot. I could rabbit trail for a while. I told Jonathan before we made this video, you're going to have to stop me because I get excited about some of these things, because there's some cool stuff in Lord of the Rings I think modern readers forget, which is why we're doing this video, one of the reasons. But contrasted with Denethor, who looks like he's doing a good job and looks like he's a king in control, and he ends up having this huge fall from grace, leading to where he ultimately thinks his son is dead, and he's going to go out and he's going to kill himself and his son. In the books, in the films, it's a little different. He goes and runs up and jumps off the cliff or whatever, but he is going to basically kill his son, Faramir, and we see this, and he's going to kill him, and he's going to die and what together and all this stuff. And so we see this very interesting, morally ambiguous, morally changing characters in those things. Let's talk about that.
Now let's talk about Denethor's children, Boromir and Faramir. We've got Boromir, who on one hand is
Sean Bean.
Sean Bean, who always dies in everything he's ever in. Is a corruptible heart, so both of these men, Boromir and Faramir, were trying to appease their father and do good for their kingdom. But their faults and their flaws are what separated them along the line and ended up giving all these intricacies and all these differences between these two characters that make them much more interesting.
So those two are kind of the protagonists, but then turning into antagonists kind of characters. Real briefly, before we move on to our third and final point, the last example we want to talk about in this, there being more interesting characters. Again, we could go into a bunch, especially if we included Silmarillion, because there's all kinds of interesting stuff. But the last one is more in the evil side, and the antagonist side is Saruman's character and Wormtongue. And we wanted to kind of highlight that those characters are more interesting. Saruman is, he's a fairly straightforward evil, but you get these interesting things with him, especially in his relationship and his dealings with Gandalf, and this kind of him being corrupted by power and wanting to become the Dark Lord and all of those kind of things. He kind of goes on more of a journey, sort of has more of an arc. And it's more of a foil for Gandalf's arc, really, for that part. But in particular, Wormtongue, again, this is the kind of the theme of these examples. A theme. There's a few things, but is some differences in the films and the books. And Wormtongue is one that is more interesting in the books. He's probably has about the same amount of time. Like there's not between more
the book and the film.
But his character is more interesting, and I alluded to it earlier in that with Wormtongue was originally kind of the advisor to Theoden, right? And in the films, the way it was shot and the way it was played is kind of basically Saruman had kind of a spell over Theoden, and so Gandalf comes in and and smacks, and they even cut it to where Saruman has got raspberry on his head,
Not on his head. Yeah.
like whatever. But that's not how it works in the books. In the books, it's more of, now, of course, Saruman is behind it, right? And he is heavily influencing Wormtongue, of course, but he uses Wormtongue. Wormtongue actually is more cunning and more cleverly manipulating
The situation.
Theoden. Yeah, and he's more actively involved in that, and so that and his Wormtongue's conniving, his all that kind of stuff is very interesting. Yeah, his Wormtongue. Exactly. He's more interesting, more subtle of a character. In fact, he is fairly pure evil. In fact, going so far as later I think in the Return of the King, I don't remember, one of the 3 books, the Witch King of Angmar comes across Wormtongue, and he basically looks at him and says, no, he's the bad guy. He's definitely evil. I'm just going to let him go. And then he goes, and so and Wormtongue, of course, goes back, and then in the books and the film, Wormtongue ultimately kills Saruman. Which is the way they did in the film is fine. It makes sense that they didn't do the sacking of the Shire. But he either shoves him off of Orthanc, or he slits his throat. Either way, but those more subtle villain characters are, again, make even within this good versus big picture good versus evil story a more interesting and more compelling thing because of these subtleties in there.
That's right. So our third and final point is that even in this giant good versus evil battle and story, there's still room. Is that what we're gonna say? There's still these subtle. Okay, yeah, not room for. Yeah, okay, all right. Mm-hmm. So our third and final point is, even in this good versus evil, this big, giant good versus evil battle, there's still these subtle metaphors and
sometimes in-your-face metaphors.
Exactly, and allusions that talk about real-world issues and even today, in his time and even today, some of them are still very, very relevant. Relevant. So the first one would be Spoils of War. This is where there's a couple of things that point to this. Frodo's PTSD is a big thing in the books and the movie. In the movie specifically, when he's just very frail at the end of carrying, and Samwise has to basically pick him up and carry him the last whatever up the steps and all that. It kind of goes back to the point that his uncle said at the very beginning of the movies, where he just felt very thin and frail, like butter spread thinly over toast. And so his PTSD is very important for the story. It's what
war
brings out
into bad things.
Yeah, war. It's
not a happy thing.
Exactly. And on top of that, it brings out we already knew Sam was a good character, good guy, but it like elevates his character even more. I feel in the end. And then second, there's the destruction of land that comes with war and all things of that nature. So there's the Ents and their destruction, and then also Isengard, the land around that, and the destruction of the forests and the land and everything when the orcs are coming in to start manufacturing things and making their kingdom.
Very, very gorgeously shown in the film.
Yes.
All that very well done.
Yes. Is that it?
For that part.
So then triumphs and glories in war.
Oh, yeah. Another theme, idea that Tolkien clearly wanted to put into his work. Not allegory. He was very opposed to allegory. These don't directly parallel the Battle of the Bulge or crucifixion of Jesus or any of it. It's not allegory, but they're definitely metaphors and things. And another one that we wanted to talk about. We talked about the evils of war, right? But you also see the glory and triumph in war and these things, and there's a couple of them in particular that are poignant, and one of those is the essentially brotherly love, band of brothers thing, and you see that extremely clearly with Sam and Frodo. This, these two soldiers in the trenches and that are going behind enemy lines, they become as close as brothers, right? And that's very clearly shown, and that concept is what I think it seems like from the reading that Tolkien would think that was a good thing, and that's portrayed very clearly. Another thing that you see in it, maybe even a more subtle way, but I think is important, and this one I think is particularly relevant to today. Now it's fairly subtle, really, in Tolkien, but that is the idea that a common goal and common fighting together, working together, can bring people that would hate each other initially. Think about cultures, think about different races, different creeds, different people. It would bring them together and make them realize that those differences are not what's important. And we see that again, it's kind of subtle, but we see that in a fun way with Legolas and Gimli, and Gimli in particular, him kind of winning over the elves, because of reasons, again, you see more of that in Silmarillion, because the elves and the dwarves essentially hate each other, but through working together towards this common goal, Gimli kind of wins them over, and you get even one of the most comedic moments in the whole series, them where they're basically at Helm's Deep, basically having this competition of how many orcs they killed and whatever else. Which is it's kind of a subtle and it's comedic, but I think it illustrates a much larger point, an idea that's really cool and really, really important.
So this last concept that we're going to talk about that Tolkien did an amazing job of, that still sticks in modern today, I guess, is the corruption of power, greed, and pride. And many times it's the weaker character who overcomes the stronger yet prideful bad guy. And this can be seen in two main big scenes. Eowyn killing the Witch King of Angmar. When she says, "I am no man," he says, "No man can kill me," and she says, "I am no man." Beautifully done, like you said.
Yeah, scene is straight out of the book.
Straight out of the book, beautifully done in the book and the film. Strong female character, beautiful. Anyway, and then secondly, of course, the last stand with Aragorn and Sauron, and while little hobbit boys are running up with the ring, he has no idea because his eyes are so focused. Because he's so prideful, he thinks nothing, as long as I keep my focus here and I point my armies here, I'm going to crush them all. But little does he know.
Because he can't even conceive of Aragorn not taking that power for himself and coming after.
In fact, the downfall of every major villain in Lord of the Rings is their pride. We hope you liked the video today. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Subscribe, ring the bell. Tell us down below what your favorite good versus evil story is. We'd love to talk about. If you got any ideas for videos, we'd love to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Y'all have a good day. Bye.
The dude. You're still John C.
Angmar. Eowyn.
I'm John C. And they look really long with this perspective.
He has arms and I'm
John C.